Hi, friends, back again. We are now on page 289. 289. Subject heading is Macroevolution Today. Let's get started. Because the data speaks so strongly against the hypothesis of macroevolution, it has changed greatly since Darwin's time. Two of the most important changes to his theory are typically called neo-Darwinism and punctuated equilibrium. They each address different problems that occur when you compare macroevolution to the data. So we must discuss each of them individually. Neo-Darwinism came first. Remember, Darwin pretty much established the theory of microevolution. But when it came around to providing evidence for macroevolution, he was stuck. When scientists began to understand genetics, they understood why he got stuck. As we said before, microevolution is simply the variation of a type of organism within its genetic code. Thus, microevolution is understandable in terms of our current understanding of genetics. Macroevolution, however, is a completely different story. In order for macroevolution to occur, a species would have to add information to its genetic code. How could that happen? Well, neo-Darwinists say that it could happen by mutation. You see, Darwin thought that all of macroevolution could occur by the normal changes that happen during the reproductive process. When scientists came to understand genetics, however, it became clear that those kinds of changes only help us to understand how microevolution works. If macroevolution were to occur, something else would have to add information to the genetic code. That something else, according to neo-Darwinism, is mutation. Remember, mutation is a mistake that alters the genetic code. Now, as we discussed previously, that alteration is often bad for the organism. But that doesn't have to be the case every time a mutation occurs. Suppose that a few good mutations could occur in a species. Those mutations might, by blind chance, produce a new trait in the organism that made it more fit to survive. This trait then would be passed on, adding new information into the genetic code of the species. What really excites neo-Darwinists about this idea is not only does it provide a means by which an organism can add information into its genetic code, but it also allows them to explain away at least some of the discrepancy between macroevolution and the fossil record. After all, mutations result in dramatic changes between parent and offspring. If macroevolution occurred by these dramatic changes, then perhaps there shouldn't be as many intermediate links as Darwin first suspected. This modification then seems to kill two birds with one stone. The main problem with this view is that when we observe mutations in the lab, or when we study nature and reconstruct cases in which mutations happened, they do not lead to an increase in the information of an organism's genetic code. Instead, they end up destroying information in the genetic code. Consider, for example, the case of antibiotic resistant bacteria. As we mentioned in module number 4, antibiotics have been used in the treatment of bacteria-related illness for some time. However, as antibiotics are used, bacteria can develop strains that are immune to them. This, of course, causes problems as a new antibiotic must be found to stop this resistant strain of bacteria. Antibiotic resistant bacteria have often been cited as evidence for macroevolution, but they are not. Some antibiotic resistant bacteria provide even more evidence for microevolution, and some antibiotic res- excuse me, and some antibiotic resistant bacteria provide even further evidence against macroevolution. How can we say this? Well, you first have to know how bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics. As you might recall from module number 2, bacteria can add to their genetic codes using conjugation and transformation. In conjugation, a bacterium that has a certain gene can pass that gene to a bacterium that doesn't. In transformation, a bacterium that does not have a certain gene can absorb it from a dead bacterium that had the gene. Most antibiotic resistant bacteria get their resistance in one of these two ways. When a population of bacteria is exposed to an antibiotic, it kills most of them. However, one or two of the bacteria might have a set of genes that makes them immune to the antibiotic. If they can pass those genes via conjugation or transformation, several bacteria can survive the antibiotic. And as they asexually reproduce, they will build an entire population that is resistant to the antibiotic. There's actually a third method by which bacteria can add information to their genetic codes. It is called transduction, and it involves the aid of a virus. If a virus infects a population of bacteria, genetic information can be passed from one bacterium to another as a result of the infection spreading. If a bacterium can survive the infection, it might have extra genetic material as a result. It is possible that resistance to an antibiotic could spread this way as well. Of course, if a bacterium becomes resistant to an antibiotic by any one of these methods, the genes which provide resistance must have already existed in some bacteria. As a result, this cannot be cited as evidence for macroevolution. In macroevolution, new genes must be created. Old genes don't help the process. One of the most convincing studies that demonstrates that bacteria become resistant to antibiotics through old genes was published in 1988. In that study, individual bacteria from the intestines of explorers who had been frozen before the development of antibiotics were shown to already be resistant to several antibiotics that had not been developed until after the explorers were frozen. Thus, the genes that produced resistance were already there. This kind of immunity to antibiotics is more evidence of microevolution. Genetic characteristics that were already a part of some bacteria's genetic codes cause certain individual bacteria to survive the harsh conditions of the antibiotic. These selected bacteria then pass on their trait of resistance to their offspring. Although most antibiotic resistant bacteria get their resistance from genes that already exist, there are some examples of bacteria that become resistant to antibiotics through mutation. In each case that has been studied, however, The resistance comes as a result of loss of information in the genetic code. For example, bacteria have complex proteins in their plasma membranes that allow nutrients into the cell. Normally, these proteins work very efficiently. Many antibiotics seem to get into the bacterium through these proteins. Thus, the proteins not only bring in food, but they also bring in the antibiotic that kills the bacterium. Well, a mutation that destroys these proteins or causes them to work less efficiently will also stop the antibiotic from getting into the cell, or at least cause the cell to take it in at a much lower rate. This, of course, makes the bacterium immune to, or at least able to survive, the antibiotic. But it also makes the bacterium weak, as the bacterium cannot get as much food as before. Now, think about it. What caused the bacterium's resistance in this case? A loss of information caused it. If the bacterium had not lost information about how to make an efficient means of getting food into the cell, it would have died. The loss of information, which would in general make it less fit to survive, helped it to survive the specific case of being exposed to the antibiotic. Did the mutation provide a survival advantage? Yes. Did it add information to the genetic code? No. If mutations are to provide the means by which macroevolution occurs, they must add information to the genetic code. So far, there has been no indication that they do. Mutations either leave the information content of the genetic code the same or they reduce it. As a result, they cannot be used to power macroevolution. Now, the fact that mutations which add information to the genetic code cannot be found has never bothered neo-Darwinists much. After all, they can always say that sometime way back when there were mutations that could do so. The problem for neo-Darwinists, however, is still in the fossil record. Even though neo-Darwinism reduced the number of intermediate links needed for evolution, it did not reduce the number to near zero, which is essentially what exists in the fossil record. This is the point that Dr. Raup, Dr. Schwartz, and Dr. Dawkins were making when they each wrote what we quoted in the past sections regarding the fossil record. Even with the revision of neo-Darwinism, the fossil record just doesn't provide nearly enough transitional forms. As a result, yet another revision needed to be made to the hypothesis of macroevolution. The latest revision is called punctuated equilibrium. Those who hold to this revision are called punctuationists, while those who hold to neo-Darwinism are generally called gradualists. This is because neo-Darwinism views evolution as a fairly gradual process, while punctuated equilibrium views it as a process that occurs in quick punctuations, followed by long times in which no evolution occurs. These are the two macroevolutionary camps that Dawkins wrote about in the quote that we presented in the section on the Cambrian explosion. In his book, he discusses the differences between these two camps. There are a lot of differences between the camps, but as the quote we presented earlier suggests, they are united by their dislike for creationists. In punctuated equilibrium, mutations still add genetic information to the fossil record, but they add it in steps that occur over very short time intervals. In between these very short time intervals, no macroevolution occurs. The idea here is that a group of organisms might be suddenly exposed to high levels of toxic chemicals or radiation. This would speed up the mutation rates among the individuals. Most of the resulting offspring would die, but a few lucky ones would get several good mutations all at once. These many mutations would add a lot of information to the genetic code, and the offspring would be more fit to survive. As the high levels of toxic chemicals or radiation continued, these few lucky offspring would produce more offspring with more mutations. Once again, most would die, but a few lucky ones might get several more mutations that added even more information, making them even more fit to survive. After just a few generations, the radiation or chemicals would be gone, and a new species would have emerged. That species would exist, essentially unchanged, for millions of years until another episode of high mutation rates occurred. Notice what punctuated equilibrium does. It still counts on mutations to add information to the genetic code of the species that is evolving, but it expects those mutations to occur over only a few generations. Thus, the intermediate links would not exist for very long. What does that accomplish? Well, if the intermediate links didn't live for very long, their chance of being fossilized is very small compared to that of the final product, which would live for millions of years, essentially unchanged. Thus, by altering the hypothesis, we can now account for the fact that no intermediate links appear in the fossil record. Now, of course, this still doesn't explain why structural homology is not echoed in the genetic code. And it still doesn't tell us why the vast majority of molecular biology data indicates no macroevolutionary trends. But at least the problem with the fossil record is fixed. This is pretty much the current state of macroevolutionary thinking today. Its proponents must cook up such scenarios to explain away the lack of data in support of it. Punctuated equilibrium actually presents a new problem for macroevolutionists. If evolutionary change happens as quickly as punctuated equilibrium exists, it becomes hard to understand how it could happen in populations that sexually reproduce. After all, if an individual gets several large mutations at once, it is significantly different from the other members of its species. However, when an individual is significantly different from the other members of its species, it is hard for that individual to sexually reproduce with them. If punctuated equilibrium really did occur, it would have to occur slowly enough to allow the mutant organism to sexually reproduce with others of its own species, so that its mutation could be passed on to the next generation, but quickly enough so that the mutants would not appear in the fossil record. Either that, or there would have to be several mutants in one generation, all of them having essentially the same mutations so that they could still sexually reproduce with one another. Both these scenarios seem to be rather far fetched. All right, friends, We are almost done with Module 9. We are going to have one more section entitled, Why Do So Many Scientists Believe in Macroevolution? That's going to begin at the top of page 293 next time. I'll see you then. Bye.